with a few days away for the Karen Handel and the Jon Ossof election that's happening in the Georgia 6th District, I wanted to be sure to go back to the debate and actually recount some of the points about the debate. To actually give you a broader sense of how it went. I know for some people it's not really an activity that they like to engage in, but I wanted to be sure to cover these points to make sure that they get an idea of what was happening and give you my insight, what I think. So there was several questions that was asked during this debate, but I'm gonna focus on some of them. I'm not gonna go through all of them. I know that for some people they recognize the famous line, "I do not support a liberal wage" by Karen Handel. I'll briefly go on that one, but I know a lot of people are already aware of it, so we'll place more emphasis on some of the other ones. So let's talk about healthcare. One of the questions that was brought up actually was about protections and how the new healthcare bill that's actually being proposed does not offer the same protections as we do right now. So to make it perfectly understood, the way that the Affordable Health Care Act actually works right now, there are 10 services that at minimum that you have to offer, and these insurance companies are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of current health status and allow that to influence the price to where they can discriminate between one to the other. Under the new Healthcare Act that's circling around right now, while that protection is actually in the bill, it allows the states to actually be able to opt out or to waive those protections. And what that actually means is that you can be in, for example, Texas, where they decide we're not going to offer those protections, but you can also be in somewhere like I don't know, Ohio, that decides they do actually want to offer those protections, and that they're placing this as if it's sort of a choice. But what it's actually doing is that it's putting people in an even more dangerous situation than before. It's not allowing the people to have choices in the matter, to be able to have access to healthcare. It's actually limiting their choices. It's actually shifting the power into the hands back into the corporations and putting us in the same situation that we were in before. Because when you think about it, in various states they have people with various medical conditions. If I, for example, live in Texas and I had a pre-existing condition, but I'm not covered. But if I'm not covered under this press protection, they decide that they're gonna waive those protections. Then that means that I'm gonna have to bite the bullet and pay thousands of dollars just out of pocket, just try to find some way to pay for this kind of coverage, or I'm just gonna not do it at all, or I'm just not gonna be able to afford healthcare coverage at all, and then I'm just gonna be put in a very bad situation where I'm gonna have to really choose what I'm gonna really do, as opposed to if I live somewhere in like I said earlier, Ohio, that does offer those protections and they do have access to more affordable coverage. So it doesn't help anybody to do that where they place it as choice, but it's not really a choice. Like you're actually giving these corporations the ability to be able to loophole themselves out based upon which state you live in, to which that's no fault of your own if you live in that state or not. You have various people who have various medical conditions all over the place. So that's what the difference is that you're that these price protections need to be implemented at a federal level, not at a state level, to where they can just opt out of it. Especially when you have mostly Republicans that hold a majority of the state legislature right now. So that's not necessarily a good idea. Now that was the big difference between Karen's position, where Karen was under the impression that they do offer protections, and they do, but of course you can opt out of it if you want to. Jon is saying no, you have to implement it across the board, no excuses at all. So I will support his position in that regard. Now let's move on to Planned Parenthood, and there was some controversy circulating around this one. So previously, around 2010, Karen had made a run in 2010 for governor, to which she lost. Now around this time, as a part of her platform, she said that she alluded to the fact that it is part of her agenda to defund Planned Parenthood in regards to breast cancer screenings, to which she rejected that because also following that, she was also a part of the Komen Foundation. And it was reported on that she was in a key role to where she directed the decisions to defund Planned Parenthood in regards to breast cancer screenings. This is mostly just a tactic that Republicans do to try to destroy Planned Parenthood. It's just to find little ways around it to where they'll say that want to come out and say that they are against abortion because they can't stop people from having abortions. Which Planned Parenthood is where you go for something like that. But what they'll do is that they'll try to defund it all the way around, and it's even a common talking point among some Republicans. Like for example, our VP, I don't know why Mike Pence, where he even continued to use that common talking point that, and I don't know if he still uses it. I know he used to use it back then. The federal government should not be funding abortions, but it's illegal to fund abortion services. The government may fund a lot of other services that Planned Parenthood offers, but it doesn't directly fund abortions. So that's a mute point. But a lot of these Republicans, what they're doing is that they're trying to defund virtually everything else around Planned Parenthood, as far as these other services, in an attempt to pretty much destroy it. So what Jon Ossof was bringing up was during this debate that you were either in a position where you directly orchestrated this decision or you did not. What's not up for debate and what she skirted around was she vehemently said that during the 2010 run that she supports the idea of defunding Planned Parenthood. And she didn't really necessarily answer that question, but she did pivot to talking about that she was not in a key role to making the decision for the Komen Foundation to defund Planned Parenthood. But I don't think that necessarily even matters because it was a part of your platform to defund Planned Parenthood. So I'm going to read this from this article right here. I'm not going to go through the entire article, but I'm going to highlight what her position was, at least at the time. So it reads, first, let me be clear. Since I am pro-life, I do not support the mission of Planned Parenthood. During my time as chairman of the Fulton County, there were several federal and state pass-through grants that were awarded to Planned Parenthood for breast and cervical cancer screening, as well as Healthy Babies Initiative. The grant was authorized, regulated, administered, and distributed through the state of Georgia. Because of the criteria, regulations, and parameters of the grant, Planned Parenthood was the only eligible vendor approved to meet the state criteria. Additionally, none of the services in any way involved abortions or abortion-related services. In fact, state and federal law prohibits the use of taxpayer funds for abortions or abortion-related services, and I strongly support those laws. That's the point that I don't know why, for some reason, Mike Pence used to always go with that particular line. It's illegal to use those funds. So as the article continues, since grants like these are from the state, I'll eliminate them as your next governor. So that is her basically saying on her website during the time that yes, I do support the idea of defunding Planned Parenthood in relations to these services. So I don't know where people like to get into this argument about whether or not she was in a key role or not. It doesn't necessarily matter. Her angle was still the same, that she still had the intent of defunding Planned Parenthood to basically try and destroy it. All right, so let's move on to the next point. There was another back and forth that was going on about partisan politics when it comes to decisions made under one administration versus the other. And this was specifically when it comes to the Syrian strikes, where in Karen's particular situation, Karen was talking about that, well, Jon Ossof brought up the point that under Obama, she did not support the strikes on Syria, but under Donald Trump, she actually did. So her retort to that was that she flipped it and she spoke on Jon Offsof's position on the Taylor Force Act. She brought up that Jon Ossof had changed the position on the Taylor Force Act, where he was actually before the Taylor Force Act, before he was actually for it. And this was also a sort of a pivot as well, that what Jon Ossof was talking about was that there's too much partisan politics going on, where the question that was proposed by WSB is that if and willing, will you actually participate in reaching across the aisle to engage in bipartisanship? To which Jon Ossof said yes, and to which she said yes. But there was also a little bit of back and forth about partisan politics as well, and this is where it came up about her double standards in relation to the Syrian strikes, and then she came back with the Taylor Force Act. But it's unknown as to whether or not what his position was beforehand during the Obama administration. All we know about is under the Trump administration what his position was and how he pivoted. So it's not necessarily a good comparison to really say, he engaged in partisan politics when it's really unknown as to what his position was originally. And even to that extent, like he even addressed it, he said, well, he had his own measure that he wanted to propose anyway. But regardless, it doesn't necessarily matter. I don't know to the extent of like where she was getting at when she was talking about that, because what he's talking about was partisan politics, and his position changed under the Trump administration, and it's not necessarily changed. Did not necessarily change, not to the extent of what I know, from Obama to Trump. So let's move on to finally the golden thing that people were always talking about, the I don't support a livable wage by Karen Handel. All right, so this one was actually gold. So the full context of the question, because I saw a lot of clips bringing this up, and I think it was proper for the context, even though it's still in context was bad. But what the question was that, do you support raising the minimum wage? This was a question that was brought up, and not only did Jon Ossof support the idea of a minimum wage, but of raising the minimum wage, but he supported the idea of raising it to a livable wage. And this is what got Karen in a lot of hot water when her response wasn't. This is like horrible response, but she said, I don't support a living wage, and she supported bringing back more jobs so you can provide competitive wages, yada 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 yada. It's that whole common talking point, and a lot of people, and some people, despite that statement, would still support Karen Handel regardless of it, because like if all you talk about is jobs, means bring jobs back over here, then they will support her nonetheless. But what they don't necessarily get is that it's a good thing to bring jobs over here, but what does that really mean in the sense of wages? You can bring all the jobs you want over here, but if your minimum wage is like $8 or whatever, you're not really bringing home any kind of change at all. You can bring all the jobs you want, but how many jobs are you going to have to work in order to make ends meet? So that was the reason why his position was a livable wage, and hers was, I don't want to have a livable wage. I just want to have more jobs. But I mean, that basically makes you a wage slave. So you contribute several hours, 60, 70, 80 hours, longer work weeks in exchange for pretty much bringing home crumbs. And since the 70s, the wages have been largely stagnant, but the profits has just been through the roof. So I think that for some people, that they would argue that the corporations, you can't necessarily impose these wages on these corporations, because they take away our job, they'll take away the jobs, and they'll basically bring about automation. But I would argue to that effect that actually automation has already been coming, regardless of whether or not you like to admit it or not. Some people think that just because you raise the wages, they're just going to switch to automation. But if you've ever been into a Walmart or a Target or an HEB, if you live down here, you've already seen in one form or another, automation has just been happening across the board. So it's this situation of where like these corporations like to argue that if you raise wages, we're just going to move to automation. So they'll keep your wages the same while their profits are constantly going up. And then on the flip side, they'll automate the shit out of their processes and make even more money. It's just a way to control their expenses and transition more and more into that direction, while fucking you over. And my position is, or the correct framing is that, I'm willing to work for a corporation, but there's an extent of the degree to which I'm allowing you to accept working for you. At least in this area, $15 or $16 an hour, which is the common wage that's been campaigned by Bernie Sanders and a number of other Democrats. I think that is an acceptable living wage across the board, at least as far as in my area is concerned. But now let me wrap this up by going to the very end where that there was a panel of three different people, and one of the people in the middle, Brian Robinson, he's a Republican strategist, had actually brought up a point, and like this is something that I thought about for a little bit, and I I it's unfortunate, but I have to agree that while I think that Jon Ossoff, in my eyes, did a very good job, and Karen came off a bit spiteful, like she got like a grudge or like a chip on her shoulder. He brought up that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he was talking about like he's all about facts and all this jazz or whatever, but he's boring, And you know what? I unfortunately in this day and age, I hate the fact that politics has sort of in transition in this direction, but I do have to say that yes, he did come off a bit stoic. He's not very personable. A lot of people bring up the points about, well, yeah, facts will win. No, we got Donald Trump. I mean, some people, unfortunately, they vote for people who they feel like they can just relate to, and sometimes they'll vote against their best interest. I mean, look at the mass deportation that's been happening with the people who've been living here. You have some immigrants who have been living here for years on end, and they voted for Trump, and then they were put in a situation where something happened along the line. They found out some paperwork wasn't filed correctly, and they get deported. It's just various stories is going on, and people tend to vote against their own interest, and sometimes they vote based upon first initial impressions, interactions, whatnot. So I'm not necessarily saying that I don't necessarily think that John would win. I wish the best for him. I think John is a better candidate, but I think that for an ideal candidate, it would be a little bit of a mixture of Jon Ossoff versus and a mixture of like he has to have some bit of a charm to him, or just let some of his character bleed too. Like you don't even necessarily even have to be charming, um, but you do have to at least be a little bit more personable to really just break through. At least in this day and age, where people don't like this stoic behavior or this polished politician or whatever. I mean, you have some polls that are measuring that they are basically virtually at a tie right now, which shouldn't be the case. I mean, this was an absolute landslide when it comes to what happened here during this debate. But I also see that based upon previous elections, that some people tend to look at this situation and say, well, okay, I don't give a shit about all the other crap he's talking about. Karen relied very heavily on appealing to emotion. That's why she came off as very spiteful to me, and that doesn't, in and of itself, it looks ridiculous to me in my eyes, but to somebody else, um, they may emote to something like that a little bit better and say, well, I feel like I'm talking to an actual human being as opposed to just some fucking robot. I don't know what the fuck that even mean. I mean, I guess like to some extent, that yes, we do relate to people better who we have some sort of an empathy with or we can sympathize with. I guess that's true, but at the same time, though, if you actually listen to the substance, Jon Ossoff, just by and large, was just a much better person. So I really hope that John wins, but I mean, I could definitely see people still voting for Karen regardless. There's another story circulating about the AHCA. This is a story from Mike.com. Senate Republicans are currently amending the House passed American Health Care Act in secret, making changes to the law without any plans to hold public hearings nor solicit input from their Democratic counterparts before bringing it to a vote. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell filed paperwork Wednesday to fast track the AHCA, allowing the bill to head to a vote without going the traditional hearing process. Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill even chimed in on this. We have no idea as to what's being proposed. There is a group of guys in a back room somewhere that are making these decisions. I know we made mistakes on the Affordable Health Care Act, Ms. Caskill added. According to one of the criticisms we got over and over again, that vote was partisan. Well, you couldn't have a much more partisan exercise than what you're engaged in right now. So that's pretty much true. So what McConnell did, like um, this was during the Comey hearing, where Mitch McConnell decided that he was going to fast track the bill to where it wouldn't have a public hearing, to where you can propose amendments to it. And what they're trying to do is that, as opposed to before, where this was getting scrutiny publicly, what they're doing now is that they're trying to do it in secret to where they can bypass that process and bring it all the way to a vote, and pretty much pass it through budget reconciliation, and also potentially with the help of the VP, push it all the way through. And it's a really shitty way of trying to push through a bill that nobody wants, with the exception of the Republicans by and large. And they're also trying to make sure that the media has that the actions that's going on right now has less exposure, with the help of the media, which actually segues me into another story. And this was actually about the proposed restrictions on the media. And another story, Senate Republicans on Tuesday had quietly backed away from a proposal to restrict media access in the Capitol after an angry backlash from reporters. In an emergency meeting between Senate Rules Committee and the media gallery directors. A senator familiar with the administration discussion says everything you did before you can still do. It was an abrupt 180-degree turn from earlier in the day when Senate Sergeant at Arms staff informed the press galleries on tough new restrictions. Democrats seized on the news, linking the new restriction to the GOP works on the health care legislation that is currently being drafted behind doors. Now, this was actually an attempt by the Republicans to actually place restrictions on media coverage during these hearings, and this was initially proposed, and then they backed out of it, and they're trying to figure out ways to lessen the blow to where it's a lot easier to push this all the way through, and for virtually a lot of people who probably follow the news, about a lot of the town hearings or town halls that are going on, where a lot of people are showing up to voice their support for Medicare for All, which is pretty much the wave of the future. And a great deal of many Republicans have not been receptive to this idea. Pretty much virtually across the board, they have been pretty partisan on this issue of trying to push the American Health Care Act through that destroys price protections. So it's not necessarily a good thing that they're trying to propose, or at least we're trying to propose restrictions on the media, but it's, for the time being right now, that they've actually backed off of that. And it's really funny coming from the people who advocate for freedom of speech or freedom of press, or actually in this particular case, it's a sort of a compartmentalization of those ideas, where they're totally for the idea when it's the left actually doing it, but when it's the right doing it, nobody really has anything to say about these situations. But I'm glad that they actually backed off this idea. But it's very sad that this idea was even thrown around, that they're trying to push this bill through, and nobody supports this bill at all. But they're trying to push it through, and then they're trying to lessen media coverage on it. It just pretty much tells you where the Republican Party has gotten to as far as listening to their constituents.